Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Paweł Zakrajewski from the English Department, University of Silesia in Katowice, and I'm very glad and I'm very happy to welcome and to introduce to you our guest and very good friend of the English Department, University of Silesia. A kind of friendship which is an everlasting one. Professor Anthony Barker of University of Aveiro in Portugal. Professor Barker specializes in literary studies, culture. Also, I would say, as far as I know him, sociology of life, sociology of culture, and sociology of literature. And today, the lecture professor is going to deliver, the title is Melodrama Meets Social Change, Mad Men, Television and Seriality. Professor Barker, it's again an honor to have you here. And I'm switching off. Zoom is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you all see me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Right. Well, once again, thank you for the invitation to address you on this occasion. It's a pleasure. With these technologies, it's perfectly possible I'm on the other side of the world, but in reality, I am here in Poland, speaking from home. I would like to call up, if I may, my PowerPoint so that the image will be shared with you, and so you can see what I'm talking about as I talk about it. So let's see if we can share this screen. And I will just go big with it so that nothing is missing. So I'm going to try and bring it up big. Oops, gone back. Let's go back to the main one. There we are. So can you all see the screen then?
Yes.
Okay, excellent.
Yes.
Right. Well, I'm talking to you today on a topic that's entitled Melodrama Meets Social Change, the television show Mad Men, Television and Seriality. And this is one of the most successful shows that's been on television in the millennium. It's ran for about 10 years, and it brings up lots of issues of cultural relevance and importance, which I'd like to discuss in a sort of general way today. So, but I'll just start with these two perceptions which come from the series. These are quotations from the show, and they show the sort of feel that the show generates. The first one is happiness is the moment before you need more happiness. What I like about the show is that it sort of encapsulates a certain kind of restlessness in American society in the 1960s, and that restlessness leads to sort of important social factors and demographic changes which we need to register and which the audience registers as they watch the series. And the second thing is the more cynical observation. People want to be told what to do so badly that they'll listen to anyone, which of course ties us into the main, as it were, setting for the show, which is the advertising industry, right? And so the advertising industry is a completely new topic for television, and something I think which is its great trick is to somehow be able to use a particular business setting to convey important aspects of social change in America. So that's my starting point, and I just want to give you a visual from things so that you, if you haven't seen it or if you haven't seen it recently, this will jog your memory. And you can see from this still what a sort of suave and sophisticated show it was in terms of its visual approach. And with the prominence of smoking there, you can see that the series obviously captures the particular mores of the time. So without more ado, I'll move into the show itself and try to confine my talk to approximately 45 minutes. So here is the wider context then, why I'm talking to you, why television matters and why this particular series matters. I remember when I was a student, there was a lot of talk about what was the great American novel. You know, what was the work, what was the War and Peace of American culture? What was the Don Quixote of American culture? And there's been a lot of argument about Moby Dick and so on, but in some respects, the most impressive achievements of the last 20 years have been in television, which is a surprise to a lot of people because television has always been considered somewhat disposable medium, something that's not terribly respectable. But in the last 20 years, we've seen the emergence of some really quite serious television programming. And I just illustrate here that what has in fact happened is that television has emerged as what you might call a writer's medium. Now, for the most part, television has been a producer's medium, which means that teams have been put together to bash out shows with a certain kind of template or formula, and those formulas have been rather reductive. So it's been easy for critical opinion to regard television as not a serious artistic form. But in the last 20 years, channels like HBO and AMC and Showtime and FX and streaming channels now in the last 10 years have begun to make original television series with extremely generous budgets. I mean, television has always had a dependence on advertising for its funding, and that also has limited to some extent how it's been able to produce itself. But with the cable network and the subscription means of funding, generous revenues have been made available to make shows. And you see in this brief list I produced here, some of the more prominent shows of the last 20 years, and the fact that they are, for practical purposes, you could talk of them as being authored television shows. David Chase of The Sopranos, Alan Ball of 6 Feet Under, Matthew Weiner of Mad Men, I'll be talking about today, Terence Winter of Boardwalk Empire, Vince Gilligan of Breaking Bad, Nick Pizzolatto of True Detective, Noah Hawley of Fargo, and Ben Oifenweiss of Games of Thrones. Game of Thrones is the odd one out there, really. I won't say much about it, but it's been such a amazing success in the last few years, but it does actually follow a different kind of paradigm to the ones I mentioned above. So what do we have with Mad Men? Well, we have a show that centers on the sort of professional lives of the staff of an advertising agency. Let me just move this across so I can see more clearly what's going on. Right, so the show centers on the professional life of staff at Sterling Cooper, a New York Madison Avenue advertising agency. The reason why I think this is culturally significant is because it captures a kind of high watermark of American consumer confidence and capitalistic culture. Undoubtedly, as we enter the 1960s, America is top dog in the world. American affluence is something that's never been seen before in human history. And this is a young country that's come of age and that is confident and prosperous and doing really well. And the show starts from that position, but it begins to erode that as it goes through the decade. And the erosion of that confidence and the erosion of American family life is one of the great themes of the series and why it manages to achieve, in my view, some very interesting effects. And while we're talking about the great American novel, you might see the central character, Don Draper, as a kind of Jay Gatsby figure. He's a somewhat charismatic, self-created character who embodies the value system of the show, which is that it is somewhat fraudulent, but also extremely glamorous in its own way. And it's that combination of fraudulence and glamour and charm which makes Mad Men work so well, I think, in popular culture. So that's just my point of departure then for the series. That's why I think it's worth talking about. So what is melodrama? Well, I've got 2 quotes here for melodrama. It's quite interesting that various theorists have talked about melodrama. Eric Bentley argues that melodrama is the naturalism of the dream life. In other words, it's a fantasy form, but it represents fantasy forms in naturalistic modes. And I think that's a fair comment generally of melodrama. Melodrama as we find it in soap opera. I would argue that Mad Men has a foot in the camp of soap opera, but is in fact a much more sophisticated version of a soap. And the second definition of melodrama is that it has the function of uncovering, demonstrating, and making operative the essential moral universe in a post-sacred age. So post-sacred age, as it were, God's not running the whole show, but nevertheless in melodrama, the good prosper and the bad are punished, right? So in that sense, you maintain a moral universe, even though you don't really have any kind of reason for that confident prediction, I think. So moving on again. So there's a sort of background now. So here are some features of melodrama so that we can tie in theory about melodrama to the show in itself, right? Melodramas begin and end in a space of innocence. Lost innocence provokes nostalgia that provokes a kind of pathos. And so you've got that in Mad Men, in Don's backstory of hardship. Don is a very extraordinary character because he's not actually Don. He's somebody else who takes on somebody else's identity in Korea and comes back a completely self-generated person, rather like the kind of orphans of 19th century realist fiction. He makes himself, and a lot of his anxiety and a lot of his meltdowns, because Don has a lot of meltdowns in the series, they have to do with his disguising his real identity. Melodramas also focus on victim heroes and the eventual recognition of their virtue. In other words, there's something about this group of people that we see who deserve to succeed. They have virtues which we can identify as the series goes along. And that comes into focus at the end when they get into open competition with another advertising agency called McCann Erickson. Incidentally, a real one. One of the things I like about the show is it uses real things, real names, in ways that you might think would encourage a very litigious culture like America to get stuck in. But in fact, a lot of the people cited in the show were quite happy to see their names used in such a popular series. Melodrama also employs an aesthetic of astonishment at the point where virtue is at last recognized as a kind of prolongation of emotional effects that dispenses with the need for action. So you wait to see certain outcomes come, and when they come, they give you a kind of payoff. And the example I give you here is Peggy, who's one of the other main characters, finally, who's unlucky in love throughout the show, finally finds someone at the end of the series. The fourth point is that melodramas employ a didactic of pathos and action, establishing a kind of tension between too late and just in the nick of time, so that time is the ultimate object of loss-provoking tease. So you've got lots of deadlines, you've got lots of crises imminent, and you've got them thwarted or averted at the last minute. And you see that there's a sort of central section about being bought out by a British company and then being sold off again. You've got Don rescuing advertising campaigns at the last minute by some brilliant pitch or some brilliant ideas. The climax of the show is, in fact, when he comes up with the sort of very famous super ad for Coca-Cola, which kicked off the 1970s, I'm not mistaken. Very, very, very famous, somewhat cheesy advert, but it's given to Don in the story, which is a bit of a cheat, I suppose, but that's how the whole series culminates anyway. And finally, characters in melodrama embody primary psychic roles organized in Manichaean conflicts of good and evil. So melodramatic characters are monopathic, that is to say they lack more complex mixes of feeling, and they often lack complex psychological depth. I'm going to argue, because of the 90-something episodes and because of the long hours we spend with these people, they do achieve a greater degree of psychological depth and mixes of feelings that one normally finds in soap opera type characters. So I think we can take the characters a little further than they are normally found in television series. The same applies to characters like the lead character in Breaking Bad, right, who is put through a series of crises and evolves and changes into another character, achieving an almost kind of Macbethian personality in that story. Right, so here's the team then. There's the Madman production team. It's basically, I would argue, authored by Matthew Weiner, a man who had affiliations with the advertising industry through his family, and so knew it from the inside. You've got a television company which is relatively small, Lionsgate, which bankrolled the series, and you've got AMC, which is the basic cable company that screened it. The episodes are basically 50-minute episodes, and they run in 7 seasons, 13 episodes a season until the final season, which had 14 episodes. But by then, there were already signs that it wasn't totally solid, but for reasons I will come to. I mean, I'm talking generally about these kinds of very successful series, and it is the case that it's very unusual for a TV drama series like this to be able to last longer than 10 years. It's hard to hold the team together. They often become the victims of their own successes. People start to ask for more money, generally speaking, and they become unstable. And also plot lines become a little attenuated, and there are difficulties in just keeping it going. And often those series that do keep going beyond that become very formulaic and lose a bit of their luster. So there's the team, and none of these actors were major stars when it was launched. They all became famous through the series, and that, of course, helps because you've got the greater ability to identify an actor with a role if they're not known from other performances. Many of them, of course, have gone on to be quite famous in other series. Okay, so this is the structure of the series. It ran from 2007 until 2015. One of the things I find quite interesting about thinking about it culturally is that it more or less preserves an absolutely constant 45-year gap between the period represented in the story, and its very faithful period, and the making of the show and the screening of the show. So it's more or less tracks it. It covers a decade, and it takes a decade more or less for the series to be played out on our screens. So that 45-year period is an interesting distinction. It's more than a generation, but it's less than 2 generations. there's an active memory of the period. For somebody of my age, for example, the show possesses a lot of charm because I was around in the 60s. And so I can sort of, not necessarily in America, but I can certainly recognize some aspects of the culture which are still experienced and lived, as it were. So it's not heritage culture quite yet. So there you have facts about the series. There's some things to notice, like the production level slows down. This is quite common for long-running and very successful series, that it becomes harder to keep generating the shows at the speed that you produce them at the front. And indeed, series 5 into 6 and then 6 into 7 slow down a bit as they're unable to do that, and they appear later in the year for production difficulties, which I may be able to talk about later. So my subject is social change. How do we show social change? It's a problem because, as Elsire says at the bottom of the page there, I put the quote there, popular culture has resolutely refused to understand social change in any other than private contexts and emotional terms. So we know that the past is different from the present, but how do we see that happening? And the reason we see it happening is through the lives of individuals, right? And so one of the ways that popular culture processes social change is through individuals and their experiences. And this is something for which Mad Men, I think, is a remarkable series, because it's very closely related to the American historical events, and it tracks them very closely. People punctuate their lives by public events in the series, and that is also picked up by the music used in the series. So it's very authentic to its time, and a lot of effort has gone into that. So what I'm really saying is not many people understand social change through statistical or economic data. They don't understand it through the analysis of mass movements or demographics or even legislation. I mean, legislation is a good way of showing that what was illegal one day can be legal the next. But none of those things really are used in this. What we see is the private lives of individuals or their public lives, and we see the way that they change and modulate over a decade in this series. So how does this work? Well, basically what I want to argue is there's been a triumph of seriality in our time, that the dominant forms of television in the previous century were essentially series, and they still are lots of series. Series predominate because they're cheaper to make, because they require less imagination. You bash out a formula like CSI and you know exactly where you are. It doesn't mean they're not well made in their own terms, but they don't really evolve to the same extent, and they don't create the sorts of narrative problems that you get with a serial like this. So features of soap have invaded, as it were, dominant forms of television. I mean, soap is traditionally dismissed as a kind of poor relation of television drama, but in fact, features of soap have been very successful, and they've had an impact on series like Mad Men and some of the others I mentioned, precisely because they're much more immersive. And it's the immersive nature that makes them work. So you've got a kind of attenuation of narrative time. It's a leisurely pace. We can get to know these characters over a long period of time, and we can see them developing, which is not the case normally with series characters who have a kind of fixity. Their fixity is the thing which we go to them for, right? But in the case of Mad Men and other parallel shows, they change over time. And think of The Sopranos, where the children in the family have to come to terms with the fact that their father is a monster, something that they gradually learn as they grow up. And that's something that these kinds of series can do very well. They can show you something dawning on someone which was not immediately apparent for the past, and they could show that realization occurring over quite a long period of time. So also you get very multi-narrative strands involving a very large cast of individuals. Mad Men has a huge cast, 300 or 400 actors have passed through the series in 90 so episodes. And that means you've got a lot of diversity and a lot of little windows on people's perception on the time, which is essentially the 60s. With this kind of show, you also get a more open kind of narrative resolution. People come in and they go out. You don't have to finish their stories. They can be glimpsed as they pass through the lives of the main characters. And so these open forms can be things like the instability of domestic relationships or the search for love, as opposed to other questions that have to do with the pursuit of professional success. And in the case of the women in the show, the desire for recognition. And this is very important. I'll come to this later on. So the season is built around event episodes. There are some special episodes in which they perform acts of sleight of hand and other sort of techniques which limit off the drama to particular characters, and there are others which are more sort of multi-strand. But they all culminate in the structure where you've got a cliffhanger episode where you finish the series. And this is usually the climax of longer story arcs, or hanging across to the next one so that you can retain your audience to the next series, which comes usually a year later. I suppose it's fair to say that the great strength of Mad Men as a series has to do with its wonderful sense of period detail, and that is down to certain technical aspects like set design, costume, and props, right? I mean, it just got to look like the time, and they have a wonderful, authentic sense of the period. But since we're dealing with a decade shift from the late 1950s to, I think it finishes in 1971, you've got to show those shifts, and those shifts are seismic in America from 1959 to 1971, and it's beautifully done. I'll give you some pictures later on just to show you that. But at the same time, an intelligent understanding of periodicity suggests that not everybody is in period. I mean, I may be living here in 2022, but I might be a person whose dress style belongs to a decade or 2 decades ago because I'm old-fashioned. And the series, I think, recognizes that not everybody will move with the times. And so it doesn't have that obligation to be bang up to date as required style, but it does create a kind of authenticity in its visual look. And Roger and Don are two characters who, to some extent, hang back in the 50s rather than running forward into the 70s. It understands that in any given office or home will be made up of furniture and items from mixed periods. So there are moments when novel stuff occurs, like when they introduced computers. Again, that's a nice touch. They introduce computers into the office and everybody's extremely jaundiced about whether they'll have any impact in the business. They're dismissive of them. And of course, the computer that enters the office in 1965 is the size of a room. It's enormous, right? And it can do practically nothing. So that's a little joke which we can enjoy as we look at the impact of computers from 50 years later. And again, there's a nice little touch here. Everything in 1960s is brand new, but when you have a kind of heritage culture where you recover items from the past in order to recreate the past, those things are not new, are they? Because they've been bought recently. So if you want as it were, a mini car from 1960, you're not going to be able to get a 1960 new one. You're going to get a 1960 very old one. And so that kind of inauthenticity often creeps into heritage type reconstructions. So here we are then. This is the visual look of the main characters of the series as it began in 1959, 1960. And you can see that sort of strong formalism which dominates the life of American offices and American corporate behavior. And there they are. These are the main characters. Bert in the corner there, sitting there, is a character who does not wear shoes in his office, but otherwise all the others are really conforming to the sort of view of corporatist America, which we learn about when we look at those books that study conformism in America in the 1950s and the McCarthy era, and the feeling that Americans were losing their soul because they were bowing to the dictates of corporate structures. So there they are in the early period, and you see the women, as it were, evolving towards the end. And so this is the visual styles of the later part of the series. And I'm really arguing that this has had a big impact. These are things that have mattered to audiences as they've watched the show, is that they pick up on these styles and they're attracted to them clearly. So there you see the sort of late 60s, more laid back styles of the women in the series. In a less professional context as well. And indeed, there is a sort of flight from New York later on in the series, which I'll talk about. The men also go to these more casual styles, more floral and cravats and more casual wear. Obviously, corporate America bent to the ethos of the 1960s. And so you see these kinds of visual styles, and the facial hair as well, and the sideboards and so on. All of that came in, and this is beautifully caught in the show. This is middle management. These are not the top of Sterling Cooper. These are the guys that worked for them, but they would be more open to the youth styles. So what matters about the show? What is it that makes it great? Well, I think my enjoyment of the show has to do with the sort of the kind of ironic understanding that the past is something from which we have escaped into the present, and that there are certain attitudes there which we can feel mixed about, okay? So the show seems to me to reflect both how people thought then in the 1960s and how we feel about those thoughts and behaviors now. And contemporary awareness of these transformations is flagged up for me in the dramatic scenes which expose casual sexism, casual racism, xenophobia, the sorts of practices of excessive smoking and drinking. I mean, half of the cast are drunk at work. They drink constantly, and nobody seems to think there's anything wrong with that. There's a constant amount of kind of belligerent office politics, and there are domestic power relations scenes as well, which give the show a kind of contemporary feel. So what have we got here? It foregrounds, I think, the actual contemporaneity of these attitudes. They are period attitudes. They're lovingly recreated, but there's a kind of double take on them. We can see that they belong in the past, but we can also see that they are a period from which we have progressed. And it does this in a conscious way, it seems to me. They're very self-consciously time-specific in a way that movies are not. Some of so I'll just take two examples. The movie Green Book, which came out about 4 years ago, it was set in 1962, but it doesn't make a big deal about 1962, or the even less prominent Brokeback Mountain, a wonderful movie, but you wouldn't necessarily say, oh, that's 1964. Those are the attitudes of 1964, because it's not really important to them that you see it as 1964. Because the show has this double take on attitudes, it gets a reputation for being a bit smug, and we're sort of laughing at these people in the way they were. I don't think we are really. I don't think its smugness is clear, nor do I think that the other view is relevant, that it somehow endorses the kind of white male entitlement that it dramatizes, at least in the first 3 or 4 series. So it's unfairly been considered a sort of favorite viewing of the nostalgic Trump supporters, as it were, somehow this is how America should still be. I think it comes, as usual, from the sort of liberal center, and looks at these attitudes and takes some pleasure from the fact that they're no longer the dominant attitudes of our time. So behavior and attitudes is interesting. Now, let's consider the historical framework. The show makes extensive use, in my opinion, of actual historical events. And whilst we're close to Sterling Cooper all the time, we're never also kept away from this. The characters always glancing off to see television screens, and these things are happening on the television screens. So one of the ways that it plots the 60s is through these major political events. And there are key episodes where these become, as it were, the center. So from Nixon-Kennedy debate, because one of the things that Sterling Cooper is asked to do is to, as it were, promote Richard Nixon. He's a difficult task to promote, but he's one of the things that they have to advertise. There's the Cuban Missile Crisis. There's lots of stuff about civil rights. There's the assassinations of JFK, Martin Luther, and Bobby Kennedy. There's lots of Vietnam behind the show. One of the boys is drafted, as they have to try to stop him getting drafted. There's a lot of urban rioting and social protest. And finally, towards the end of the series, there's the moon landing, which was a major event in 1969. So these events sort of key in the historical period. As well as major historical events, you've got the major cultural events as well. And there are whole episodes like Don is supposed to take his children to see the Beatles at Shea Stadium. So that also is brought in. The episode I might want to talk about a bit later on, episode 46, has as its background the fight between Cassius Clay, Muhammad Ali, and Sonny Liston. And everybody's betting on that in the office, and they're watching it off, and some go to it and some don't go to it. And it's in the background of the whole show, episode 46, right? But there's case of the Yom Kippur War and Israel's cause. There's aspects of other concerts by the Rolling Stones and Bob Dylan. There's films that are playing on which have got a certain cachet. Rosemary's Baby is mentioned, as is Planet of the Apes. And again, towards the end, one of those sort of seminal events in the crisis of the 60s, the moment when the sort of party ended, was the Charles Manson, Sharon Tate murders, which are also foregrounded in the series. So it offers a complete prospectus of public and private American history as a backcloth to the series. So the role of music is also very important. It's a complete kind of experience of the 60s. Each episode, with some exceptions, fades to black on a period song or a tune which offers a kind of commentary upon the action. There's a lot of American popular music you can draw upon, and it does. So there's a thoughtful rhetorical flourish, it seems to me, at the end of every episode, I'm mentioning episode 46, which is called The Suitcase. And this one finishes on Simon and Garfunkel's song Beaker Street, part of the sort of folk turned social commentary revolution of the 1960s. And the Liston Muhammad Ali fight was in fact, I think, a week before this song was released. So they're very careful to make sure that they're not just arbitrary associations, but they're actually chronologically close. There's other non-diegetic music as well supplied by the composer, but always very much consonant with the period. And it's difficult to talk about Mad Men without discussing its extremely elegant opening credit system and its theme tune with its sort of symbolic fall from a glass tower of the Don Draper figure, a character who in one way or another is always falling in the show. He's rising and falling like a kind of paradigmatic hollow man like J.J. Gatsby. And of course, he falls past a tower reflecting the kind of images of advertising, which is his métier. Okay, so, and here is the sort of image I've just been talking about. You see him lounging in elegance in his suit and then with a cigarette, and you see the sort of images of women which make up advertising. And that of course, was a very attractive image for the series. And you know when you've arrived in popular culture when you're parodied by The Simpsons. So here we have it, right? An episode of The Simpsons which actually produces a full parody of the title sequence of Mad Men. And that's a kind of a popular cultural form endorsed by another popular cultural form, which is, I think, part of how popular culture recycles itself even in its own time. So on we go then. I think the show is disarmingly frank about the manipulations and misrepresentations of the advertising business. In other words, it contains an implicit critique of the restlessness. That quotation I gave you at the beginning about people want to be told what to believe in. They want to be told what their desires are. They want them channeled. They want to be pushed. And that's really the heart of the social critique of America in the 1960s. America is restless and disturbed and doesn't know what it wants. It's undergoing a revolution. In all this plenty and all this abundance, there is spiritual malaise, and that is reflected in the series through the pushing of products through advertising, which I think is kind of an interesting way to go. So just to give you a breakdown of what happened, about 84 companies and products are used within the narrative of the life of a professional advertising agency. 69 of those are actually real companies with real products, and they're all trading. So it doesn't use the usual subterfuge of disguising who you are. At the beginning of the series, they must have been rather nervous about that, because 8 of the companies they use in the first series are fake. You can therefore be more sort of critical of what they do. But by the time the series was an established success, which was definitely towards the end of the second series, companies were sort of lining up to be talked about. And so it gets more and more real, so to speak. And the real companies come in, and there are other factors. I'll come to them later on. But 7 of the companies that have been mentioned no longer exist. They've gone out of business for one reason or another. But by and large, the presence of real products in American consumer life is the strength of the show. It's really there to tell you that they were tracking history and tracking real things in history rather than making them up. So, interesting cases, just to stay with this. I think the only company that I know paid to have their company talked about was the beer company Heineken. Heineken actually was so taken with the series that they wanted episodes about Heineken beer, and there are episodes about Heineken beer, so they actually put up money to have themselves, and they were very happy about it. Hershey bars, the chocolate bar, also loved the publicity, even though there's a scene in which Don Draper has a sort of complete crack up. Nevertheless, the principle seems to be that there's no such thing as bad publicity. And there's a company called Koss Headphones, which actually makes, hi-fi equipment. And they appeared on the show, and they had a huge surge in demand for their products, which is obviously an incidental byproduct of the show. There are negatives as well. If they only puffed things, it would be a less significant cultural achievement. And in the negatives include the whole business about smoking, because one of the themes that runs through the show is that people are coming to realize that smoking is a dangerous thing. The advertising industry had a terrible role in suppressing evidence that smoking caused lung cancer. And so one of the great companies that they depend on is Lucky Strike. And so Lucky Strike gets a bad press in the show, but partly because the tobacco industry was one of the most mendacious industries of its time. Jaguar Cars likewise gets a bit of a bad rap from having some rather low morality scumbag executives who want to push their cars. And lastly, American Airlines had a bit of a problem as well, because it actually tracks a real crash that happened in the 60s, which was not good. And Dow Chemicals was also fingered for its responsibility for the various reagents used in Vietnam, the napalms and the Agent Oranges, which they had produced. And so they didn't come out of that too well. So there are a number of sort of interesting implications of the use of the real in the story. It had courage, I think, to both praise certain things and also to denigrate certain things in its own time. I think the number one, the heart of the show, the thing that gave it its greatest resonance and greatest success, was that it's a particularly good historical account of changing gender relations, right? It starts with a world that belongs to men, right? The world of executives in a company, it's a man's world, and the women are pushed around and exploited and sexually abused and denigrated and generally regarded as somehow just helpers, right? And together with that professional limitation, there's also the private limitation in the character of Betty Draper, Don's wife, who is the classic housewife who is supposed to be happy, but is in fact deeply unhappy. And she's not at all well treated, even though she's living amid all this plenty and living the paradigmatically happy suburban wife life. So all of that begins to degrade across the show. Affairs by Don and various other characters and a sort of heavy drinking begin to take their toll. But as we watch this thing pass through it, so the women began to emerge, they begin to grow more confidence, they begin to assert themselves, they begin to break out of these secretarial roles in which they're chronically exploited and patronized, and they begin to hold the organization together, and they begin to hold the men to their jobs as well. And so by the time we come to the end of the series, we have a much more balanced situation, which you might think is a little complacent, but in fact, it's hard won in the show. The women have to put up with a lot, it seems to me. And the thing I like about the show, I think, is that ultimately the main characters who we're supposed to identify with and empathize with, many of them are quite despicable. They do quite despicable things. I mean, Don, to his friend Roger, makes him walk upstairs. He dummies the lift so it doesn't work and makes him walk upstairs. And he's violently sick and practically has a heart attack because Roger had flirted with his wife the previous day. He just takes a revenge. And there's quite a lot of bad behavior of that kind. So our main characters do not behave like white-hatted cowboys at all. They behave like quite unpleasant people. And the show is not afraid to show characters very unsympathetically. And possibly the most unsympathetic representation in the show is their parenting, which is absolutely abominable. The way that they raise their children or neglect their children. Don famously goes out to get his child a birthday cake and never comes back. He never returns. He goes off with some woman. And that stuff happens all the time in the show. And what I do like about the show is the way that the children grow up. This is something that all of these shows have, the ones I referenced at the beginning. They all use children at the beginning, and they all have those children coming to adulthood by the end of the series. And in that, there is a wonderful progression of realizations, not just in the case of The Sopranos, but also here, where Don's daughter comes to understand Don, and she has a terrible relationship with her mother. But when her mother catches cancer at the end of the series, she has some reconciliation between them, because through all of this vicissitude, they begin to grow some kind of mature understanding. So the representation of children in the show is terrifically good. And it's something that these TV series can do well, because they've got the time and they've got the quality actresses and actors, and they've got the ability to script realistic responses to situations which are changing and have a certain amount of depth. So I think that the gender relations are strong, but also family relations are well done. It's something that soaps normally concentrate on, but it's just done much better in this show. So I'm getting towards the end. I just want to make some general observations about the series. And one, we can actually see how audiences responded to the show, because we can go to IMDb, the movie database company, where people vote on the episodes they like, right? And so you can get a kind of understanding of what it is people like and what they don't like. And you can see that the show reaches its kind of high point in series 4, right? And around 4, we start to get production schedule slows because it's difficult to hold this all together. And you can see that the show also gets into trouble in series 6. There are some very dodgy episodes in series 6, some episodes that people really did not like. And I can see why, because the writing of the series gets into some difficulty in keeping the characters, as it were, to consistency. And there are some mistakes made along the way. So the series is looking like it's in trouble by 7, but it comes roaring back in 7. And one of the ways that these series come roaring back is by people announcing that this is going to be the last series. As soon as you tell a popular series audience that this is going to be the last series, they come back to watch it because they realize just how fond they are. Nobody was happy with the last series of Game of Thrones, but they were all back watching it like their lives depended on it. So the other thing that you notice is that it takes a while to build your support. So the early series of Mad Men were not nearly as popular as the series from 3 through 5. So 1 and 2 had lower audience levels and lower appreciation, but it's building. You see, you build just in the same way as when you read a novel, you're not as engaged with it for the first 10 pages because you need to get into it. But once you're into it, you can be hooked. And so the middle section, 3 to 5, had people generally hooked. Trouble in 6 and then roaring back in 7. Generally speaking, across a series of 13 episodes, the early episodes were less popular than the middle episodes, and the later episodes, of course, tended to be more popular. So you look at the way that they assess them, and clearly they need to be reintroduced to the series after the hiatus between series, because they basically come out in 13-week blocks across a year, so that there's do the math, 30-something, 35 weeks when the show's not on, new editions. Of course, these things are in syndication, so you can catch them in repeats. But essentially, you need to pick up your audience again and carry them forward. And there's a certain loss of audience at the beginning, but which it gains momentum and usually builds to the final episodes. This would be my assessment then. The highest rated episode was an episode called The Suitcase, which is the one I've been talking about with the Sonny Liston. It's a two-hander with Don and Peggy. Basically, just the two main characters appear. It's the exact midpoint of the series, and it's basically the two of them working late into the night to solve a problem about Samsonite suitcases. How do you sell a suitcase? So it's both technical as to do the advertising, but it's also their relationship, which of course deepens at this point. 5 of the most popular episodes in the series are the final cliffhanger ones, so people have hung on to see how things resolve. And this tells you something I think important about TV series, is that people want an outcome. There's a lot of talk these days about wanting interactive media, but I'm not sure that people do want interactive media. I think they want something authored that tells them what it means, that something drives to a point. And it's clear that the most popular episodes were those which seem to get to the point of the series. Okay, the least popular episodes were mostly all in series 6, where I think Matthew Weiner went wrong in trying to darken the character of Don to the point where he became positively disagreeable. And there's even one sadomasochistic episode, 6.7, the 7th, where Don sort of tortures his neighbor's wife, and in a way that's really quite disagreeable. And it's a plot line they discontinued, so clearly they understood that they'd gone too far. But you get that kind of stuff. You've got room for making errors and bringing people back. So then, here are my conclusions then, as I enter, I think, the 45th minute. Audiences are challenged by complex openings and they prefer closings. That's the effect of immersion, right? The more immersed you are, the more engaged you are, the better you enjoy it as you go along, right? So that's generally true. They approved of the later episodes rather than the early ones. The core of the show was the relationship between Don Draper and Peggy Olson, a boss-secretary relationship, but in this case, very interestingly, not a sexual relationship. Everybody assumed that Don was sleeping with his secretary, but she was the one secretary he wasn't sleeping with. So the man-woman respect versus sex contrast was played out across the whole 10 years with, bad behavior on both sides, but a kind of affinity which the stories establishes. Generally speaking, the work center episodes were more successful and more popular than the domestic centered ones. Somehow people enjoyed the sort of cut and thrust of the workplace in Mad Men, so they were not that engaged so much with the backstories, which there were plenty of. As I say, the bad parenting is something that I certainly noticed in the show and thought was really rather well done. The fourth point I would make is that it's impossible to ignore the look of Mad Men as a kind of basis for its success. It was just simply a well-achieved visual production value, which few shows manage. I mean, fantasy shows can create their own reality, but this is something that had to be true to people's memory and to styles, and it was immaculately researched from that point. And Mad Men, the show, just to give it the full arc, like the 1960s it purported to represent, became less shapely and coherent as it progressed. So the series, to some extent, loses its way. Not totally, but to some extent. Both the business and the professional lives of the characters become more chaotic. There's less stability towards the end, as the 60s, I think, was truly the case, right? So arguably the show loses its tight New York focus from the beginning and starts to disintegrate as a sort of running off where the characters sort of go to California, or they drop out, or they take on alternative careers, right? People go to communes. One guy becomes a Hare Krishna and all that sort of stuff. And everybody is off to California because there's a sort of shift in the 60s towards California as perhaps the heartland of the new American culture. So that, I think, is what happened to the show. And I don't have to argue that the show is perfect from first to last to suggest it's a very significant cultural achievement. And so that would be my case for Mad Men and why we should take television seriously, and serial television even more seriously. So I just finished with this brief bibliography of reading in the area of serious television. These are some books about how television works and why it's come of age, in a sense, in this time. And lastly, to finish, I want to finish with this quote from David Cronenberg, who is a man who never made anything but television and had the lowest possible opinion of television. But he said recently that the cinematic equivalent of the novel is really a Netflix series that maybe goes on for 5 or 7 years. Really, this is a new art form. It's not like old television series. I'm seeing some series I thought were really quite brilliant. He doesn't mention Mad Men, but could. Fantastic, and really like a novel. I thought maybe the cinema as we know it is really writing a short story. But if you want to write a novel, then you have to do a series. There you go. See, so somebody who all his life, like Woody Allen, despised television, and now turning their hand to television production because it's actually a place where an auteur, where a writer, can see their conceptions realized in space and time, it seems to me, because of the problem of television production has always been the hurry and the mass production of the import of adverts that sort of distort it. Well, in this case, I think we have a fairly elegant solution to the problem. So that's my talk. Thank you.
Professor, thank you. And I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me? Yes? Right?
Yep. Can hear you fine.
I've been observing the chat, but I also checked my email box, and I got 2 questions to you. My email box.
Shoot.
I also have a few questions, but I'll try to cut long story short. So first question, and it's a question from the person without name, but doesn't matter. The question is, what's the role of television in your opinion nowadays, right? So it is, does it carry any educational value, and what about the TV series? Because the person writes that I believe that it's translation from Polish, right?
Yeah, sure.
Polish. I believe that the TV series you are talking about carry educational values.
Sure.
What about television nowadays and its future? Educational values or what? It's a translation from Polish.
Right? Sure. Well, I make no bones about it. I'm talking about the cream of television here. Mm-hmm. I mean, one of the great revolutions of television in the last 30 years has been the defunding of terrestrial television. So that bread and butter television, which you get free to your TV set, has been impoverished by the exit of a mass audience. I mean, when I was a kid and all through my growing up, 6, 7, 8 million people all saw the same television show. Now audiences are fragmented. And because audiences are fragmented, there's no money to make television shows. So what's happened from the 1990s? The emergence of reality TV. Reality TV is not good TV, it's cheap TV. That's the whole point of it. It doesn't cost anything to make. People beg to get on TV. They don't need money. So reality TV, like Big Brother and all its successors, is simply a way of making cheap television. And of course, it's driving down. So terrestrial television has been impoverished. But the revolution I've been talking about is where money has come back in, because with subscription TV, you can raise money, you can have high quality production. But I'm not convinced that except in specific cases, it has an educational value. I don't believe Game of Thrones had a very strong educational value. It's immensely popular and a highly crafted product. But I mean, the values that one finds in these things are, for the most part, entertainment values. But I do think that Mad Men distinguishes itself in that sense that it tries to offer Americans a view of their own history. So it does do that. That is, I think that might be a byproduct of its more sensational melodrama interest in the loves and losses of Don Draper, right? So it works very well as a sort of spicy, love interest story, but the background is tremendously well realized. So if you're asking me generally whether television has abrogated its responsibility to be educational, I think it may never have had it. I mean, national television like the BBC did, because the figures at the beginning, like Lord Rees, put education ahead of entertainment, right? But that was eroded by the arrival of independent TV and commercial TV, which from the start said we aim to be popular so that we can generate revenue through advertising. And the public service ethos has been under pressure ever since the 1950s. And I think it kind of broke up in the 80s with Reagan and Thatcher, where the idea was that things have got to pay their way. So if you've got to pay your way, you can't really be educating, because as we know, education is a massive drain upon public resources. So there are educational functions along the byway, but I think the essential point of TV is that it is a commercial entertainment form. And what we're really looking for here is not education in a direct form. You get it in TV documentary, but what you want is quality entertainment. You want entertainment that's thoughtful. If I suggest that Breaking Bad offers us a kind of contemporary version of Macbeth, that's because it's good. That's because it asks dark questions of what people will do under pressure, right? The guy is given a death sentence, and out of the fact that he isn't getting any insurance and nobody cares about him, he turns to crime. And so, that's a story that resonates, I think, with a lot of people. So there is an education in there, but you have to mine it out, because it's the education which we get from great art, not the education we get from being taught. You see, so that would be my answer.
So could we say it's just my comment that the television is like tailored made, client, customer oriented,
Yeah.
Right? So as you said, because you said that it's my quotation, disposable medium, right? So
Yeah.
from innovation, disposable medium, and now we have like tailored made. So
Sure.
it answers your needs. Would you confirm that?
Well, absolutely. And when you live in a world of 700 channels, then entertainment and education and everything else has been segmented to the point where no one form, unless it happens to be, I don't know, some major sporting event, there's nothing which anybody is really watching in any large numbers. And so our tastes have been fragmented to the various parts of the universe, and everything is broken down into, melodrama or music or pornography or whatever. They all have their separate channels and their separate followers. There has been a disintegration of the mass audience. And what these channels are trying to do is, by quality, they're trying to pull back a mainstream audience. Whether they achieve it or not, I don't know, because ultimately what will prevail are commercial realities. And I think what we all hope is that quality will out. In other words, if you make something good enough, people will make an effort to see it. Now, that means in the world we live in that they will pay for it. But when I was a kid, you didn't pay for quality TV, because under Lord Reith, they were supposed to give you quality television. That was your birthright. Not anymore. I think you have to pay for anything that's good. But people are sufficiently clued into what is good and what is not to be prepared to pay. And that's why this revolution has occurred. It's limited in its scope, but it is a significant cultural event.
So can we talk about the plurality of audiences?
Yes, very much so. There are people who only watch reality TV. There are people who are junkies for the news. There are people who like this kind of drama. And of course, there's a segmentation. It's not merely by education, it's by age. So there are certain, I mean, it's axiomatic, for example, that the films that are being made for release in the cinema these days are tailored to 14-year-old American boys. You know, the target audience of a Marvel Universe picture is a 14-year-old boy. If you make a film for the intellectual age of a 25-year-old, you're going to lose some money, you see. So there's age segmentation, there's gender segmentation to some extent. The market researchers know more or less who their target audience is, and very few films can claim appeal to a very broad range of people. Very few.
All right. We can't talk nowadays. We can forget about like family films, right? They gather all families as it was in the past. Like, and there was
I see what you mean. Yeah.
Your house. So because in the past, like there was like one remote, right, one TV set, and
Sure.
so
no, it's under pressure. I mean, look at a company like Disney. I mean, Disney used to have a niche making entertainment for children, but the point is that the demographic was driven down, so that the target audience is younger and younger and younger. So Disney has now become mainstream, and Disney makes products for everybody, right? So because there's no real discrimination between a Disney film and a 20th Century Fox film or a Warner Brothers film, because they're major players in the world, and they're also promoting HBO and so on. So yeah, it's fragmented, and it's market driven, and it's now sitting on enough piles of money to be able to make high quality products. So it's just a matter of whether it will give the talent its chance. And what I've argued in this presentation is that those men, who's predominantly men, I must say, but doesn't mean there is no space for women, but the guys who produced those TV series were given the scope to make the show they wanted to. And in that sense, and for the first time, you can consider shows to be authored. And if they're authored, they have a particular worldview. And it's my argument in this presentation that people want authored art. They don't want open-ended stuff. They want something with a point of view. And that's where these series come in, I think, is that they have that point of view.
Mm-hmm. All right. So I will move to the second question I got to my email box.
Sure.
Okay, and then I will go back to my question.
Sure.
The question is, it's also it's in English, but the question is, don't you think that Mad Men was a reflection of American dream? Well, it was, but it's question to you. So was it a reflection of American dream in those times, in the 60s, 70s?
Well, it had all the ingredients of the American prosperity and abundance. I use the word abundance because, you know, America is unquestionably the richest and most successful nation in the world around circa 1960. But the story is dark as well, because it's not like the characters are happy. They're not. They're anxious and restless and ambitious and driving. Now, you may say that in a state of questing towards success, you are happy, but it doesn't seem like they're very happy. They're very anxious. They drink too much. They're looking over their shoulder. I mean, the character Pete, for example, is a sort of younger version of Don. He's a Don wannabe. And the fact that you've got characters who aren't realizing their ambitions, who are jealous of other characters, strongly suggests that the American corporation is a place of some insecurity rather than happiness. The American dream is a bit of a formulation I've always had trouble with. I mean, the American dream is a formulation put out by Americans to suggest that anything is possible. But in the greatest of art, limitations have to be acknowledged, right? And there are limitations even in America. And so the greatest American artists understand those limitations, and they factor aspiration into limitation. And that's what you get in Gatsby, right? He can't have the girl, right? He can't have her. He's got all this money and all this success, but he can't have her. And that's what we have to live with in life. You don't get everything you want. And so the American dream is a kind of chimera, you know? Mm-hmm. Americans are more aspirational than other people, but they also, as we see in Mad Men, more inclined to disillusionment. And in the case of this series, most of the lives fall apart. They're sort of held together by professional etiquette at the beginning, but in the second half of the show, in the series 6, which they didn't like and say fine, they disintegrate. They basically fall apart, or they reconstruct themselves in some other way or in some other place. But things do not as it were, hold together, and it's not a steady march towards happiness. So it's a critique of the American dream rather than a realization of it. It's like a Garden of Eden. It's all there, but we fuck it up basically, and that's what they do.
So wouldn't you say it's like uncovering, this is a kind of uncovering the method for American dream. So it's like showing everything that is usually like behind, that we don't want to show how we reached, right? How this American dream came true, right? Because it's not like something nice to boast, right? Boast about how you reached, right, certain goals. So
but you've got to remember this: it's about an advertising agency, and an advertising agency is in the business of desire. They're basically stimulating desire so that people will be uncomfortable, and they say that and nobody's really happy. They all want more. And that drive to wanting more and that sort of overstimulation of people's acquisitive urges is part of what the characters themselves embody. So they're not happy with where they are either. And this I use the word restlessness because it's like kind of steady restlessness, which I think is at the heart of Matthew Weiner's view of America in the 60s and 70s. And behind that, you've got the great public upheavals like civil rights and Vietnam and so on, which are things about which Americans could not be happy, right? They were destabilizing. That the world that you start with in the 1950s is that kind of all-white dream of picket fences and suburbia, right? But it's shown to be a lie in Don Draper's life, his own home life, you see. And so we start with myths, and those myths crumble in the stories. Even while characters are showing that they live in great prosperity and abundance, their restlessness and their anxiety does not let them achieve any kind of equilibrium. And that's what I find great about the show.
Mm-hmm. And now my question is the future of seriality, right? Looking at Generation Z, right?
Yeah.
Z1, right?
Yeah.
Can we talk about any future, or it will be also kind of a tailored? We'll talk about tailored TV series, right? So like for them, right? Something we might not understand, our generation. What do you think?
I don't know. I mean, I've never been able to identify different. I mean, there are clearly different generational tastes, no question, but it mostly goes to content. There are television shows. America is famous for targeting, teenagers. So they make shows, Buffy the Vampire Slayer. They make shows deliberately for age groups, and they're very good at them, and they're very well made for the purposes they're made. My interest has always been in a television that sort of goes beyond packaging a formula of entertainment and actually tries to make sense of the restless spirit of America, or the heart of social justice, as in Breaking Bad, or the relationship between business as usual and crime, as in The Sopranos. You see, they ask harder questions, I think. Now, whether the young will drive towards some other form of entertainment other than that kind of television, I'm really not sure, because I'm not really possessed of a crystal ball there. I think most of the paradigms will continue. After all, terrestrial TV is still churning out the same stuff. The rank and file of television production is more or less the same as it was in the 1980s and 90s. You could argue that film culture has gone backwards in terms of producing only a very narrow range of fantasy, highly, highly imaginative at the level of special effects, but in terms of its moral complexity, extremely shallow, right? So cinema, I mean, and Cronenberg said this about Christopher Nolan. He said, what a great filmmaker he is, but why is he making Batman movies? Why isn't he making something more significant than that? So there are problems in these kinds of cultures, but definitely the way film culture has gone is because it's market driven by the desire to reach that youthful demographic. And unless you can sort of establish a segment which has grown-up people who want grown-up interests represented, I fear that it will remain segmented and somehow never go much beyond the sorts of quality TV that I've recommended here, but also the vast mass stuff will be formulaic and short duration, because that the American television industry is absolutely brutal when it comes to cutting off things which are not successful in TV series, 3 series, and then you cut. So the average life of a TV show is 2 to 3 series. The fact that they went 7 in this one and they went 8 in Game of Thrones and lots of others is an achievement. To go 8 series at House, which was a good TV terrestrial series, made 9 series, I think. But that's about the limit because they don't hold together after a while. They're sick of the sight of each other and they want to go.
But the same like concerns Poland. That first of all, you need to calculate, right, how many episodes you're going to
exactly. Yeah.
Is whether it's really worth, and because less than 12, it's something that doesn't bring any,
Yes, well, there's an economics of scale operating, and as in the case of the Lord of the Rings film, where they basically had to plan 2 and 3 so that the people didn't sort of depart like Christopher Lee didn't want to come back or come back for more money. And so they have all these kinds of economic realities which are invisible to consumers, to program lovers, but they actually determining in what gets made and what doesn't get made.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Professor, this lecture will be available online. So if it happens that somebody would like to ask a question, these questions will be sent to me, and then I will direct questions to you.
By all means, I'll be happy to reply to them. I just hope people go and see the show. I mean, it's available on DVD. It's available on streaming. Take it from the beginning. Enjoy it. It's an immersive experience. Enjoy it. I really think it was a high quality product. Not perfect. No, I'm not claiming it's perfect. I can identify flaws in it myself, but just really engaging experience, like a massive novel, just very, very big work of fiction.
All right, so it's like reading, but reading subtitles or simply like watching, right? In novel. Thank you so much. Thank you for coming. Thank you for being our guests, and hope to hear more. Right.
Sure. It was a great pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me.
So much. Yeah. Take care and have a good spring holiday. Thank you so much.
Okay. Bye. Have a good Easter then. Bye bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Ciao. Ciao.